I can still remember that night like it was yesterday. It was a chilly Friday evening in early October, and my friends and I were having a sleepover at my house. I was 16, and like most teenagers, I was always looking for something exciting to do. That night, we were bored, and the usual movies and snacks just didn't cut it. My house was an old Victorian, creaky and full of shadows, the kind of place where every little noise made you jump. The living room was filled with antique furniture, and dusty family portraits seemed to watch us as we moved about. I loved this house, but it had an eerie vibe that sometimes made my skin crawl. "Chloe, what are we going to do?" Mia, my best friend, asked, flopping down on the couch. She had long, dark hair and a skeptical nature that often balanced my adventurous spirit. "I don't know. We could watch a scary movie?" I suggested, but even I could hear the lack of enthusiasm in my voice. Liam, our resident jokester, leaned against the wall with his arms crossed. "Boring. We need something more thrilling. How about a Ouija board?" I felt a shiver run down my spine at the suggestion. A Ouija board? Seriously? I glanced at Sophie, who was sitting quietly in the corner, her eyes wide. She had always been the quiet one, the girl with a mysterious aura. I recalled how Sophie had once insisted the old abandoned house down the street was haunted, a place she avoided with palpable fear that always made me wonder if she knew something we didn't. "Come on, it'll be fun," Liam insisted, flashing a grin. "What's the worst that could happen?" I hesitated. I had always been fascinated by the supernatural, but I also knew the stories about Ouija boards. They were supposed to be dangerous, opening doors to things that should remain closed. But part of me was curious. I wanted to prove I was brave, to show my friends I could handle it. "Let's do it," I said, surprising myself. We rummaged through the attic, pushing aside old boxes and dusty blankets. That's when I found it, a weathered Ouija board, its letters faded and the planchette chipped. I felt a mix of excitement and dread as we carried it back to the living room. As I held the board, a strange, almost magnetic pull seemed to emanate from it, compelling me to engage with it. I pushed the unsettling feeling aside, determined to confront whatever lay ahead. "Okay, how do we do this?" Mia asked, her tone now more serious. "Just put your fingers on the planchette and ask questions," I explained, trying to sound confident. We gathered around the table, the flickering candlelight casting eerie shadows on the walls. The tension in the room was palpable as we placed our fingers on the planchette, each of us feeling the weight of what was to come. "Is anyone there?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. At first, nothing happened. We exchanged nervous glances, and I could see Mia's skepticism returning. But then, the planchette began to move, slowly at first. "Whoa! Are you doing that?" Liam asked, his eyes wide. "No. I swear I'm not," I replied, my heart racing. The planchette spelled out a name, Isolde. "Who is Isolde?" Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible. There was a hint of fear in her tone, and I couldn't help but wonder if she knew more about this spirit than she was letting on. "I don't know," I said, feeling a chill run down my spine. "Let's keep going." As we continued to ask questions, the messages grew darker. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice shaky. "Leave now," the planchette spelled out, and a cold draft swept through the room. We all jumped back, our hands flying off the board. "This is creepy," Mia said, her eyes wide with fear. For a moment, I saw a flicker of doubt cross her face, as if she was reconsidering her skepticism. "Maybe we should stop," Sophie suggested, her voice trembling. But I was too curious. "No, let's ask it something else," I insisted, feeling a strange compulsion to continue. "Chloe, don't," Mia warned, but I ignored her. "What do you want from us?" I asked again, my heart pounding. The planchette moved slowly, spelling out, "I want the doll." "What doll?" I asked, confused. A sudden chill ran down my spine as I remembered the old porcelain doll I had found in the attic a few days ago. It had been sitting in the corner of my room ever since, its lifeless eyes watching me as I slept. I couldn't help but wonder if there was a connection between the doll and the spirit we had contacted. Though it was only an inanimate porcelain doll, its lifeless eyes, fixed in the corner of my room, felt unnervingly alive. The doll seemed to draw my attention with a silent, sinister urgency, as if linked to the board in ways I couldn't yet understand. Suddenly, the lights flickered violently, casting frantic shadows that seemed to dance menacingly on the walls. The room grew oppressively heavy, as though an invisible force was pressing down on us with relentless intensity. Without warning, the air grew thick and oppressive, making it hard to breathe. Dark shapes seemed to writhe at the periphery of my vision, while an icy sweat coated my skin, as though the air itself had conspired against us. "Let's get out of here," Liam yelled, and we all scrambled to our feet, our hearts pounding. We ended up spending the rest of the night in the kitchen, our laughter and chatter forced and uneasy. We never spoke about what happened that night, but I could tell it had affected all of us. In the days and weeks that followed, strange things started happening. I would hear whispers in the dark, and I would see shadows moving out of the corner of my eye. I started to feel like I was being watched, even in my own home. One night, as I lay in bed, the silence of the house was oppressive, every creak of the floorboards and distant whisper of the wind magnified into a menacing symphony. As I fumbled for the lamp switch, its dim light struggled to pierce the oppressive darkness, casting more shadows than it dispelled. A chill gripped me, as if the very air had turned against me. The next day at school, I confided in Mia. "I think something followed us home from the Ouija board," I said, my voice low. She frowned. "You're just stressed. It was just a game." "I know, but it felt real," I insisted. "And then there's the doll." "What doll?" she asked, confused. "The one the board mentioned." "I don't know why, but I can't shake the feeling that it's important." Mia rolled her eyes, but agreed to help me look for it. We searched my house, but I couldn't find anything that resembled a doll. That night, I had a dream. In the dream, I saw the porcelain doll sitting in the corner of my room, its eyes staring at me. I woke up with a start, my heart pounding. The dream had felt so real, and the doll's lifeless gaze seemed to haunt me even after I opened my eyes. I couldn't help but wonder if the spirit we had contacted was trying to communicate with me through my dreams. I need to get rid of the board, I decided. But part of me was still fascinated by it, and part of me was too scared to touch it. A few days later, I gathered my courage and went to the attic. I found the Ouija board sitting there, untouched. I picked it up, feeling a shiver run down my spine. As I held it, I felt a strange connection to it, as if it was calling to me, drawing me in. That night, I decided to use it one last time. I gathered Mia, Liam, and Sophie again, hoping to find answers. "Are you sure about this?" Mia asked, her voice shaky. "I have to know what it wants," I replied, feeling a mix of fear and determination. We sat up in the living room again, the atmosphere thick with tension. I placed my fingers on the planchette, and we began to ask questions. "Is anyone there?" I asked, my voice trembling. The planchette moved again, spelling out, "I want the doll." "What doll?" I asked, my heart racing. "Why do you want the doll?" "Mine," it spelled out, and I felt a wave of cold wash over me. Suddenly, the lights went out, plunging us into darkness. Without warning, a deafening crash shattered the silence, followed by the chilling tinkle of glass fragments scattering across the floor like falling raindrops of ice. I felt a sharp pain in my arm, and when I reached down, my fingers brushed against broken shards. "Get out," a voice whispered, its tone dripping with malice. We all scrambled to our feet, but I couldn't move. I felt rooted to the spot, as if something was holding me back. "Chloe, come on," Liam shouted, pulling me toward the door. As we fled outside, I glanced back at the house, and for a fleeting moment, I saw a figure in the window, its eyes glowing with an unsettling intensity that made my blood run cold. We spent the rest of the night at Mia's house, too terrified to go back. I felt a sense of dread settle over me, and I knew I had to get rid of the board and the doll once and for all. The next day, I gathered the Ouija board and the porcelain doll. I took them to a park near my house and buried them deep in the ground, saying a silent prayer that I was doing the right thing. From that day on, the strange occurrences stopped. I never told anyone what I had done, and I never used a Ouija board again. But I never forgot the lesson I learned that night: some doors are better left unopened. Years later, I still think about that night. I wonder about Isolde, the spirit we contacted, and what she wanted with the doll. I often find myself staring at the shadows in my room, half expecting to see her watching me. I've learned to respect the unknown, to understand that some things are better left alone. And while I still have a fascination with the supernatural, I know now that curiosity can lead to dangerous places. As I sit in my living room now, I can't help but glance at the shadows dancing on the walls. I remind myself that some mysteries are best left buried in darkness, and though the shadows still dance on my walls, I'm at peace with the boundaries I've set. After all, the past is a haunting thing, and sometimes, it's better to let it rest. When my family first told me we were moving to California, I was a mix of excited and terrified. We'd lived in Chicago my whole life, and suddenly, we were picking up and moving to some isolated house in the middle of nowhere. It felt like we were leaving everything behind, and not just physically. The idea of starting over in some eerie, unfamiliar place was daunting, but I tried to stay optimistic. The house was supposed to be this sleek, modern marvel. From the pictures my mom showed me, it had huge windows, clean lines, and this stunning view of the forest. I pictured myself in a shiny new place with endless room to spread out, but reality hit harder than I expected. When we arrived, the house looked more imposing than inviting. The large windows that were supposed to be a feature now seemed to cast long, eerie shadows, and the surrounding forest felt like it was encroaching on our new home. Our dog, Max, was the first to sense that something wasn't right. He started barking at the ceiling at all hours, a sound that echoed through the empty rooms like a distressed call. My parents tried to dismiss it as Max just being unsettled by the move, but it was hard to ignore the chill that ran down my spine every time I heard his frantic barking. The worst came a few days after we settled in. I remember waking up to a silence that felt too heavy, like the kind of silence that follows a terrible storm. I found Max lying in the basement, lifeless. He had been such a vibrant part of our family. Finding him like that was devastating. The vet said it was likely an accident, but there was something about the way he'd been found, his body twisted in a way that suggested a struggle, that made me think there was more to it. "Jason, I know you're upset," my mom said, trying to comfort me. "But we've got to focus on getting settled." I nodded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. The house felt off, like it was hiding something from us. I tried to talk to my parents about it, but they were too caught up in the logistics of moving to pay much attention. As days passed, the strange occurrences didn't let up. I started seeing things out of the corner of my eye, shadows that darted just beyond my vision, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. It was like the house was alive, and it had a dark, malevolent energy. One night, things took a turn for the worse. I woke up to the sound of something scratching at my door. My heart raced as I crept out of bed and opened the door, only to find nothing but the empty hallway. The scratching had stopped, but my nerves were shot. I lay awake, convinced that the house was trying to communicate something. The next day, while exploring the attic, I stumbled upon a hidden door behind a stack of old boxes. It was covered in dust, and when I pried it open, I found a small room filled with old, bizarre artifacts, jars filled with odd substances, candles, and a strange, leather-bound journal. My hands trembled as I picked up the journal, flipping through pages filled with cryptic symbols and writings in a language I didn't recognize. That evening, I tried to show my parents what I'd found. "Mom, Dad, look at this," I said, showing them the journal. "I think there's something seriously wrong with this house." My dad, always the skeptic, glanced at the artifacts and shrugged. "Jason, it's probably just old junk. There's nothing to worry about." But I couldn't shake the feeling that these items were linked to the strange occurrences. As the days went by, things only got worse. The whispers turned into full-blown voices, and the shadows seemed to grow bolder. My sister, Emily, started having nightmares and refused to go anywhere alone. One night, things reached a breaking point. I was in my room when I heard a loud bang coming from the basement. I grabbed a flashlight and headed down, determined to confront whatever was causing the disturbances. As I descended the stairs, the temperature dropped, and a cold draft swept past me. My breath misted in the frigid air as I reached the bottom of the stairs and saw the hidden room's door ajar. Inside, I found the room transformed. The artifacts were arranged in a circle on the floor, and the journal lay open, as if someone, or something, had been reading it. My heart pounded as I approached the center of the circle, and a voice, low and growling, whispered in my ear, "Get out." I spun around, but no one was there. The lights flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. My flashlight flickered weakly before dying completely. The whispers grew louder, and the shadows seemed to close in around me. Panic surged through me as I stumbled back up the stairs, desperately trying to escape the suffocating darkness. I raced to my parents' room and pounded on the door. "Mom, Dad, something's happening down there. We need to get out." My parents, groggy and confused, followed me downstairs. They found the room exactly as I had left it, but they couldn't see or hear anything out of the ordinary. My mom sighed, looking at me with a mix of frustration and concern. "Jason, it's just your imagination. Maybe you're still adjusting to the move." But I knew what I had seen and heard. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. I couldn't stay in the house any longer. The next day, I decided to investigate the history of the house. I went to the local library and found records about the previous occupants. What I discovered chilled me to the bone. The house had a dark past. It had been the site of occult rituals conducted by a man named Arthur Gray, who had lived there in the 1970s. The rituals were said to summon spirits and harness dark energies. According to the records, Gray had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and the house had been abandoned for years before we moved in. I returned home with the information, determined to confront my family about it. "You have to believe me," I said, laying out the documents. "This house is dangerous. We need to leave." My dad looked through the papers and finally seemed to take me seriously. "All right, we'll get out of here. But we need to do this carefully. We can't just leave everything behind." That night, we packed our things and prepared to leave. The house seemed to sense our plans and reacted violently. Doors slammed shut, windows shattered, and the whispers turned into angry roars. It was as if the house was fighting to keep us trapped inside. As we made our way to the car, the house's oppressive presence felt almost tangible. The air was thick with malevolence, and I could feel the house's anger as we drove away. It was a relief to finally leave, but the experience left a mark on us all. We found a new place to live, but the memories of that house lingered. In the end, I learned that some places hold more than just walls and floors. They hold memories, and sometimes, dark secrets. The experience changed me. I'm more cautious now, and I've learned to face my fears head-on. The house in California may be behind us, but it's left a lasting impression on my life. And as much as I wish I could forget, I know that the shadows of our past will always be a part of us. It was a dark and stormy night as I drove my old Ford Taurus up the winding mountain road. The rain was coming down in sheets and I could barely see the road in front of me. I was on my way home from visiting my sister in the city. I had stopped at a little roadside shop on the way to pick up a few souvenirs. As I browsed the dusty shelves, an old woman approached me. "Looking for something special, my dear?" she asked in a raspy voice. "Well, I'm not sure," I replied. "Just browsing for a nice trinket to remember my trip." The woman smiled, revealing a mouthful of crooked, yellowed teeth. "Perhaps this will catch your eye," she said, pulling an ornate, golden amulet from beneath the counter. It glinted in the dim light of the shop. I was immediately drawn to the amulet. It was beautiful, with intricate designs etched into the surface. "How much?" I asked. "For you, my dear, only $20, the woman said. "It's a steal." I didn't even haggle. I just handed over the cash and slipped the amulet into my pocket. As I left the shop, the old woman called after me, "Be careful with that, my dear. It's more than it seems." I didn't think much of her warning at the time. I was just excited to have such a lovely piece of jewelry. As I got back on the road, the rain seemed to let up a bit. I put on some music and settled in for the long drive home. But as I drove, strange things started happening. My car began to sputter and jerk. The radio kept cutting in and out, playing nothing but static. And I swear I saw shadowy figures darting between the trees along the side of the road. I pulled over to the side of the road to check the car. Everything seemed fine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I put the car in gear and continued on my way, gripping the steering wheel tightly. As I rounded a sharp curve, my car suddenly lurched to the side. I slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The car careened over the edge of the cliff, tumbling end over end. I screamed as the world spun around me. But then, everything went black. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on the ground in a strange place. I was surrounded by tall, shadowy figures chanting in a language I didn't understand. The air was thick with the scent of incense and the sound of drums. I tried to sit up, but my head was pounding. I reached into my pocket for my car keys, but they were gone. The amulet was still there, though, glinting in the dim light. I gripped it tightly, feeling a strange energy coursing through it. The chanting figures seemed to sense my movement. They turned towards me, their faces obscured by hoods. I tried to scramble to my feet, but they were on me in an instant, grabbing my arms and holding me down. I screamed for help, but no one came. The figures just continued their chanting, their grip on my arms tightening. Suddenly, a bright light flashed in the distance. The figures scattered, hissing and cursing. I took the opportunity to break free and run. I ran through the strange, shadowy landscape, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear the figures pursuing me, their chanting growing louder and more frenzied. Finally, I saw a glimmer of light in the distance. I pushed myself harder, desperate to reach it. As I drew closer, I realized it was the entrance to a cave. I ducked inside, hoping to lose my pursuers. The cave was dark and damp, but it was a welcome relief from the strange, shadowy world outside. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to catch my breath. I could still hear the chanting in the distance, but it was fading. I don't know how long I sat there, waiting for the figures to give up their search. But eventually, the chanting stopped and the cave fell silent. I cautiously made my way to the entrance, peering out into the strange landscape. It was eerily quiet. There was no sign of the figures or the strange, shadowy world I had been in. I stepped out of the cave, my legs shaking. I had no idea where I was or how to get home. All I knew was that I had to get as far away from that place as possible. I started walking, hoping to find a road or a town or something that would lead me back to the real world. As I walked, I couldn't help but think about the amulet in my pocket. It had to be the cause of all this. The old woman's warning echoed in my mind. Be careful with that, my dear. It's more than it seems. I pulled the amulet out of my pocket, holding it up to the light. It seemed to pulse with a strange energy, like it was alive. I shuddered, suddenly afraid of it. I was tempted to throw it away, but something stopped me. I had a feeling that the amulet was the key to getting out of this place. So I slipped it back into my pocket and kept walking. I don't know how long I walked, but eventually I came upon a road. It was a winding, mountain road, not unlike the one I had been driving on before. I breathed a sigh of relief, hoping it would lead me back to civilization. As I walked along the road, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but there was no one there. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Finally, I saw a car approaching in the distance. I waved my arms, trying to flag it down. The car slowed to a stop, and the driver rolled down the window. "Are you okay, miss?" he asked, his brow furrowed with concern. "I'm lost," I said, my voice shaking. "Can you help me?" The driver nodded. "Sure, hop in. I'll take you to the nearest town." I gratefully climbed into the car, settling into the passenger seat. As we drove, I couldn't help but glance nervously out the window. I half expected to see shadowy figures lurking in the trees. But there was nothing. Just the winding road and the trees, bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun. I let out a shaky breath, trying to calm my nerves. The driver glanced over at me, his expression one of concern. "You sure you're okay?" he asked. I nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just a little shaken up, that's all." The driver nodded, his eyes returning to the road. We drove in silence for a few minutes, the only sound the hum of the engine. Finally, we reached a small town. The driver pulled over to the side of the road, turning to me. "This is as far as I can take you," he said. "There's a diner just up the road. You can call for a tow truck there." I thanked him and climbed out of the car, watching as he drove away. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, taking in my surroundings. The town was quiet, with only a few people milling about. I made my way to the diner, pushing open the door and stepping inside. The place was empty, save for a few patrons sitting at the counter. I approached the counter, ringing the bell. A waitress emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "What can I get you, hon?" she asked, her voice thick with a southern accent. "I need to call a tow truck," I said. "My car broke down on the mountain road." The waitress nodded, reaching under the counter for a phone. "Sure thing, sugar. Just let me get you the number." As she dialed the number, I glanced around the diner. It was a quaint little place, with checkered floors and a jukebox in the corner. It felt like a world away from the strange, shadowy place I had been in. The waitress handed me the phone, and I dialed the number for the tow truck. As I waited for someone to answer, I couldn't help but think about the amulet in my pocket. It felt like a weight, a constant reminder of the strange and terrifying events of the night. I knew I had to get rid of it, to break the curse that seemed to have been placed upon me. But I also knew that it was the key to getting home, to escaping this strange and dangerous world. As the tow truck arrived and I climbed inside, I made a decision. I would hold on to the amulet, at least for now. I would use its power to find my way home, and then I would find a way to break the curse. I just hoped that I would have the strength to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Because I knew that the amulet was more than just a trinket. It was a gateway to a world of darkness and danger, a world that would stop at nothing to claim me as its own. The night I'll never forget started like any other. It was the late 1980s, and I was driving home alone from a late shift at work. The winding road through the woods was as familiar to me as my own reflection, and the only company I had was the faint hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of the wind against the trees. It was well past midnight when the real trouble began. I remember the exact moment my sense of safety shattered. It was when I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw something that made my heart nearly stop. A man was sitting in my back seat. At first, I thought I was seeing things. But as I looked closer, I realized he was holding a knife. The blade gleamed in the faint light of the dashboard, and his eyes were locked onto me. Panic surged through me. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly I thought I might break it. I needed to stay calm, think clearly, and figure out how to get out of this mess. I quickly turned my gaze back to the road, trying to keep my breathing steady. My heart was racing, and I could barely focus on the twisting turns of the road ahead. The figure in the mirror was not making any moves, which was both terrifying and puzzling. Was he waiting for the right moment? Or was this some kind of sick game? I tried to remember any useful tricks from crime shows I'd watched. Keep your car moving, don't make sudden stops. So I kept driving, my eyes flicking back to the mirror every few seconds. The man remained still, his face partially obscured by shadows, but the knife was unmistakable. Suddenly, he moved. Just a slight shift, but it was enough to send a jolt of fear through me. I made a split-second decision to pull into a dimly lit rest area that was coming up. Maybe if I could make it to a place with some lights, I could figure out my next move. I pulled in and parked, but the man didn't move from the back seat. I glanced around the empty lot, trying to decide whether to get out and call for help. The rest area was deserted, and the nearest phone booth was too far away. I needed to stay in my car, at least for now. I started the engine again and drove back onto the road, this time with my eyes glued to the rearview mirror. My plan was to drive until I saw a populated area or until I could figure out what the man was planning. The minutes stretched on, and the man remained eerily still. It was almost as if he was toying with me. I kept expecting him to lunge at me, but he didn't. The uncertainty was maddening. It felt like the quiet before a storm, and I was bracing for the impact. I decided to take a risk. I turned onto a side road, hoping that by deviating from my usual route, I could shake him off. The road was even narrower, twisting through the forest, and my headlights barely cut through the darkness. I could hardly see anything outside the small circle of light in front of me. Suddenly, I felt a shift in the air. The temperature in the car seemed to drop, and a chill ran down my spine. I glanced in the mirror again, and there he was, now closer, his face more visible. The gleam of the knife was unmistakable, and the look in his eyes was one of cold determination. I needed to get to my driveway. If I could just make it home, I could lock the doors and call the police. I pushed my foot down on the accelerator, hoping that speed would help me get away from him. My house was only a few miles away now. I could see the familiar shape of it in the distance, the welcoming sight of the porch light cutting through the darkness. Relief surged through me, but it was short-lived. As I turned into my driveway, I suddenly felt a sharp pain in my back. I jerked forward, realizing too late that the man had somehow managed to move from the back seat to right behind me. In a panic, I slammed the car into park and threw open the door, leaping out and stumbling onto the driveway. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I turned around, but before I could react, I felt something cold and slimy grip my ankle. I looked down to see a bloodied hand reaching out from the back seat. Screaming, I pulled free and ran to the front door. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly fumbled with the keys. I finally managed to get inside, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My whole body was trembling, and I collapsed against the door, trying to catch my breath. I must have passed out from the shock, because the next thing I knew, I woke up in a hospital bed. The sterile white walls and the beeping of medical equipment were a jarring contrast to the night's horrors. A police officer was sitting by my bed, his expression one of concern. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. I nodded, though I felt far from okay. The officer explained that the man in my back seat had been found dead, apparently having suffered a fatal injury during the struggle. It turned out he was a known criminal, and I was incredibly lucky to have escaped with my life. As the days went by, I tried to piece together what had happened. The officer mentioned something about a hitchhiker who had been picked up earlier in the night. My mind raced. Had I unknowingly picked up the killer earlier in the evening? The realization made me shiver. The experience left me with a deep-seated fear of driving alone at night. Every time I got behind the wheel, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was lurking in the shadows, waiting to make a move. I tried to convince myself that it was all just a bad dream, but the lingering dread was a constant reminder that some nightmares come true. In the summer of 1965, my family and I set out for a vacation that was supposed to be relaxing and enjoyable. The trip started off as most family vacations do, an early morning departure, the excitement of getting away from our daily routine, and endless chatter about what we'd do once we reached our destination. We were driving through the winding roads of the countryside, heading to a quaint little town nestled in the mountains. The drive was picturesque, with rolling hills and dense forests on either side of the road. Dad was behind the wheel, as usual, with Mom beside him. My younger brother, Danny, and I were in the back seat, playing travel games and arguing about who got the last piece of candy. Everything was going smoothly until we approached a particular stretch of road. This section of the road was known for its long, eerie tunnel. It was a relic from a bygone era, a narrow passageway that cut straight through the mountain. Local lore suggested that it was haunted, but Dad dismissed it as local superstition. He had driven through it many times and never encountered anything unusual. Still, the tunnel had an unsettling reputation, and I couldn't help but feel a bit apprehensive as we neared it. The entrance to the tunnel loomed ahead, a dark, gaping maw that seemed to swallow the daylight. Dad turned on the car's headlights and slowed down, preparing to enter the tunnel. The interior of the car was illuminated only by the dim glow of the dashboard lights and the faint beam of our headlights. As we drove into the darkness, I glanced out the rearview mirror and froze. There was a figure in the back seat. It was faint, almost translucent, but it was definitely there. My heart skipped a beat, and I blinked rapidly, trying to clear my vision. When I looked again, the figure was gone. I must have imagined it, I told myself. Mom, Dad, did you see anything? I asked, my voice trembling slightly. Dad gave me a reassuring smile, though I could see a hint of concern in his eyes. It's probably just shadows playing tricks on you. Nothing to worry about. We pressed on into the tunnel, and I tried to shake off the unsettling feeling. The air inside was damp and cool, and the sound of the car's engine echoed off the stone walls. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, and I felt a growing sense of claustrophobia. Suddenly, the car began to shake. At first, it was a slight tremor, but soon the vibrations became more intense. The dashboard lights flickered erratically, and the radio emitted nothing but static. My parents exchanged worried glances, and Mom's grip tightened on the armrest. "Is everything okay, Dad?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Dad tried to stay calm. "I'm not sure. It's probably just a rough patch. I'm going to try to keep the car steady." The shaking continued, and the temperature inside the car dropped noticeably. It felt like an icy hand was gripping the air around us. The moaning sound we heard earlier grew louder, filling the car with a low, mournful wail. It seemed to come from all around us, reverberating off the tunnel walls. Danny, who was usually fearless, was now clinging to my side, his face pale with fear. I could see tears welling up in his eyes, and I felt a surge of protectiveness toward him. I glanced out the back window again, and there it was, the ghostly figure was back. This time, it was closer, its features more distinct. The figure had hollow eyes and an expression that seemed frozen in a scream. I could see the faint outline of what looked like a tattered old coat. The sight was enough to make my blood run cold. "Dad, it's back!" I shouted, trying to get his attention. Dad looked in the rearview mirror, and his face went ashen. "What in the world?" he muttered, trying to focus on the road. He accelerated, hoping that getting out of the tunnel quickly would help us escape whatever was causing this disturbance. The ghostly presence seemed to press against the car, making it harder for Dad to keep control. The car jolted and swayed, and the shaking grew more violent. The moaning sound became deafening, and the headlights flickered wildly, casting grotesque shadows that danced along the tunnel walls. Mom was now gripping the dashboard, her knuckles white. "We need to get out of here," she cried, but Dad couldn't make the car go any faster. It felt like we were stuck in some kind of nightmarish limbo. I looked around desperately, trying to find some way to help. The tunnel seemed endless, and the ghostly figure was closing in on us. It moved closer and closer, its face now almost pressed against the back window. Its eyes seemed to bore into mine, and I could see the anger and desperation in its expression. Just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, the ghost's face appeared right next to Dad's window. The apparition was so close that its face was almost touching the glass. Dad let out a terrified scream, and the car veered uncontrollably to the side. We skidded against the tunnel wall, and I could hear the sound of metal scraping against stone. "Hold on!" Dad shouted, trying to regain control of the car. He fought with the steering wheel, his face contorted in fear and concentration. The car wobbled back and forth, and the shaking was almost unbearable. Mom and I screamed as the car lurched dangerously, and Danny buried his face in my lap, sobbing. I felt a surge of panic, fearing that we might not make it out of this tunnel alive. My mind raced with thoughts of what might happen if we didn't escape. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we burst out of the tunnel and into the daylight. The sudden light was blinding, and the car jolted forward as if it had been freed from some invisible force. The shaking stopped abruptly, and the oppressive air lifted, leaving us in a stunned silence. We pulled over to the side of the road, our hearts racing and our breaths coming in short gasps. The tunnel loomed behind us, dark and foreboding. None of us spoke for a few moments. We were too shaken by the experience to articulate what had just happened. Dad turned to us, his face pale but determined. "I don't know what that was, but I never want to go through there again." Mom nodded in agreement, her hands still trembling. "We're never driving through that tunnel again. It's not worth the risk." We continued our journey, though the mood was somber and the excitement of the vacation had been replaced by an uneasy sense of relief. The rest of the trip was uneventful, but the tunnel haunted our thoughts. Whenever we drove through tunnels afterward, the memory of that ghostly presence would resurface, making us all shiver with fear. To this day, whenever I think about that tunnel, I can still feel the cold, oppressive air and hear the ghostly wailing that filled the car. The experience left an indelible mark on me, a reminder that some places are better left unexplored. And as for driving through that tunnel again, well, that's something I'd never even consider. It was a crisp October evening in 2010 when Jake and I decided to take a drive to celebrate our anniversary. We'd been dating for 2 years, and I thought a quiet night drive through the countryside would be the perfect way to mark the occasion. We were both excited about escaping the hustle and bustle of city life for a few hours. Little did we know, the night would turn into a terrifying ordeal we'd never forget. Jake and I had spent the day exploring local farmers markets and trying out cozy cafes, but as dusk settled in, we decided to head out on one of those winding, dark country roads we'd read about. It was a path less traveled, famous for its scenic beauty during the day but known for being a bit eerie at night. The road was flanked by dense trees that seemed to lean in, creating a tunnel of darkness. It was exactly the kind of adventure we had in mind. We'd just entered the road when I noticed the first sign of trouble. In the dim light of the dashboard, I saw a truck's headlights appearing in the rearview mirror. At first, I didn't think much of it. It was a quiet country road, so a truck wasn't entirely unusual. But as the minutes passed, the truck's high beams became increasingly blinding. "Jake, can you see that truck behind us?" I asked, trying to peer through the glare of the headlights. Jake glanced in the mirror, his brow furrowing. "Yeah, I see it. It's been tailgating us for a while now. Maybe they're in a hurry." We were driving at a reasonable speed, and Jake was doing his best to stay within the speed limit, but the truck seemed to be unnervingly close. Every time Jake adjusted his speed, the truck mirrored his movements, maintaining a constant, unsettling distance. "Let's pull over and let them pass," I suggested. "This is getting a little creepy." Jake nodded and carefully maneuvered the car to the side of the road. We waited, expecting the truck to whiz by us. But the truck didn't move. It remained right behind us, its high beams still glaring through our rear window. It felt like the truck was a menacing presence, not just another vehicle on the road. "What's going on?" I said, my voice tinged with anxiety. "Why isn't it passing us?" Jake's expression was one of growing concern. "I don't know. It's like it's waiting for something. Let's just get back on the road and see if it leaves us alone." We resumed our journey, but the truck followed suit, its headlights now even more blinding. The eerie glow made it difficult to see the road ahead. The darkness outside felt oppressive, and the truck's relentless pursuit only amplified the sense of dread. The road began to twist and turn more sharply, and the truck's behavior grew increasingly erratic. It would speed up when we did, slow down when we did, and every time we tried to change lanes or pull over, it seemed to shadow our every move. The situation was becoming unbearable. "Jake, this is not normal," I said, my voice trembling. "We need to get out of here. This is really freaking me out." Jake was visibly tense, his grip on the steering wheel tightening. "I know. I'm going to try to find another road. Maybe we can lose it." We took a sudden turn onto a smaller, even more remote road, hoping to shake the truck off. The narrow path was barely wide enough for our car, and the surface was uneven. The truck followed, its headlights casting eerie shadows that danced along the trees. Jake accelerated, hoping that the rough terrain would slow the truck down, but it seemed to have no trouble navigating the bumpy path. The truck's high beams continued to pierce through the darkness, and its engine roared with an unnatural intensity. The noise was deafening, and it felt like we were being pursued by a relentless predator. "Jake, we need to do something," I cried, panic rising in my voice. "This is insane." "I'm trying," Jake shouted back. "I don't know what else to do." The truck's behavior grew more aggressive. It seemed to be playing a cruel game, accelerating and braking in sync with our movements. The road was now a blur of darkness and blinding light, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Jake took a sharp turn onto a dirt path, hoping to escape. The car bounced violently over the uneven ground, and I could hear the scraping of metal against gravel. The truck followed, its headlights cutting through the night like searchlights. We skidded around corners, the car swaying dangerously. Then, without warning, the truck's headlights grew even brighter, and I felt a jolt as Jake swerved to avoid a large rock. The car lost traction and began to skid. My stomach lurched as we went crashing through the trees, the impact jarring and disorienting. The car finally came to a stop, and the engine sputtered to silence. We sat in the wrecked car, stunned and breathless. The truck's headlights had vanished, and the oppressive noise of its engine was gone. The only sounds were the distant rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of crickets. I glanced around, trying to understand what had just happened. "Are you okay?" I asked, turning to Jake. He looked at me, his face pale and covered in sweat. "I think so." "Are you?" "I'm okay," I said, though I could feel a throbbing pain in my side. "But where did the truck go?" We carefully exited the car and surveyed the damage. The front end was crumpled, and one of the wheels was stuck in a ditch. The truck was nowhere in sight. It was as if it had vanished into thin air. The road was eerily quiet, and the only light came from the faint glow of the moon filtering through the trees. Jake called for a tow truck, and we waited in the cold night air, trying to process what had just happened. The tow truck driver arrived an hour later, a grizzled man with a skeptical look. "You folks all right?" he asked, eyeing us with curiosity. "What happened?" Jake and I tried to explain, but our story sounded absurd even to our own ears. The driver listened with an expression of doubt, but he helped us get the car out of the ditch and back onto the road. By the time we finally made it home, the sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. As we sat in our living room, trying to shake off the lingering fear, we couldn't make sense of the night's events. The phantom truck had disappeared without a trace, leaving us questioning our sanity. We couldn't explain why it had followed us or why it had vanished so abruptly. The experience had left us deeply unsettled. We vowed never to drive on that road at night again. The memory of the blinding headlights and the relentless pursuit haunted us, turning what should have been a romantic evening into a nightmarish ordeal. To this day, the mere thought of that road sends a shiver down my spine. Every time we drive through a dark, winding road, I can't help but recall the phantom truck and the terror we felt. The experience was a stark reminder of how quickly a peaceful night drive can turn into a terrifying ordeal, leaving us with an indelible mark of fear and uncertainty. It was the summer of 2002 when our family decided to take a long-awaited weekend getaway. After a hectic few months, Mark, my husband, and I were eager for a break. We had 2 young boys, Tim and Danny, full of boundless energy and excitement. We planned a trip to a cabin by a lake in the mountains, and the drive through the countryside seemed like the perfect way to start our vacation. We loaded up our minivan with bags, snacks, and our 2 excited boys, and set out on a Friday evening. The sky was painted with hues of orange and pink as the sun dipped below the horizon. The road ahead was winding and narrow, flanked by tall trees that created a canopy of shadows. It was the kind of road that looked charming by day but took on a different character as darkness fell. The first hour of the drive was smooth. Tim and Danny were chattering away, playing games and asking questions about the cabin. Mark and I exchanged smiles, enjoying the peace of the drive and the thrill of the adventure ahead. But as night settled in, things began to change. The minivan, a reliable vehicle we'd had for years, suddenly began to act up. The engine sputtered and the dashboard lights flickered. Mark's smile faded as he glanced at the gauges. "I think we might be having some trouble," he said, his voice tinged with concern. I looked around, feeling the unease creeping in. The road was dark, and the trees seemed to loom closer. "Should we pull over and check it out?" I asked. Mark nodded, maneuvering the van to the side of the road. The van came to a jerky stop, and Mark got out to lift the hood. I stayed inside with the boys, trying to keep them calm as the night grew darker around us. As I tried to reassure Tim and Danny, I noticed something strange out of the corner of my eye. Through the windshield, I saw a faint flicker of light moving between the trees. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then the lights began to form shapes, vague, ghostly figures drifting among the trees. "Mom, what's that?" Danny asked, his voice trembling. "I'm not sure, sweetheart," I said, trying to sound brave. "It's probably just some animals or lights from another car." But the figures seemed to move closer, and the chill that ran down my spine told me it wasn't just my imagination. I saw ghostly shapes, translucent and misty, hovering among the trees. They appeared and disappeared as if they were playing a cruel game of hide-and-seek. Mark returned to the van, his face drawn and pale. "I didn't find anything wrong under the hood," he said, trying to hide his worry. "But we need to call for a tow truck. The phone's dead, though." He reached for the phone, but it was useless. The headlights, which had been on when we stopped, flickered and then went out entirely, plunging us into darkness. The only light was from the waning moon, casting eerie shadows through the trees. "Stay close, kids," I said, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "We're going to be okay." Mark tried to restart the van, and to our surprise, it roared to life. But instead of running smoothly, the engine made an odd, grinding noise. The dashboard lights flickered wildly, and then, without warning, the van began to move on its own. "Mark, what's happening?" I cried, my voice rising in panic. "I don't know," Mark shouted back. "The van's driving itself." The steering wheel jerked in Mark's hands, and the van veered off the road, plunging into the darkness of the forest. The trees seemed to close in around us, and the headlights cast eerie, elongated shadows that twisted and turned. The ghostly figures that had been watching us now seemed to surround us, their spectral hands reaching out from the woods. The van picked up speed, weaving between the trees with alarming unpredictability. Mark fought with the steering wheel, trying to regain control, but it was as if an unseen force was guiding us, determined to keep us on this nightmarish path. "Hold on!" Mark yelled, his voice strained. "We need to get out of this." The boys were crying in the back seat, their fear palpable. I turned around to comfort them, but it was hard to stay calm. The van's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic, and the ghostly figures were now pressing closer, their pale faces visible through the windows. "What is this?" I whispered, clutching the seat in front of me. "Why is this happening?" The van continued its wild ride, and the sense of dread was overwhelming. Every turn seemed more precarious, and the headlights illuminated a steep cliff ahead. The van was heading straight for it, and there was nothing we could do to stop it. "Mark, we're going over the edge!" I screamed. Mark's face was a mask of terror as he struggled with the steering wheel. "I can't control it. It's like it's being pulled by some invisible force." The van hurtled toward the cliff, and just as we were about to go over the edge, it stopped abruptly. The headlights shone ahead, revealing the terrifying drop below. We were suspended there, hovering inches from the edge, surrounded by ghostly hands that reached out from the darkness. We were trapped in that nightmarish moment, the fear almost palpable. The ghostly figures pressed against the windows, their faces twisted in silent screams. The van's engine roared as if protesting against the invisible force holding us in place. Then, without warning, the van was released from its eerie grip. It dropped back onto the road with a violent jolt, the impact sending us all reeling. The car skidded to a stop, shaking as if it had just narrowly escaped a terrible fate. We sat there in stunned silence, the ghostly figures gone and the forest eerily quiet. The van's lights flickered back on, and the engine settled into a normal hum. Mark and I exchanged looks of disbelief, our faces pale and covered in sweat. Are we okay?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I think so," Mark replied, his voice unsteady. "But what just happened?" We got out of the van carefully, our legs shaky as we surveyed the area. The forest was still and silent, and there was no sign of the ghostly figures that had surrounded us. The cliff we had nearly gone over was now visible, a daunting drop into the darkness below. Mark checked the van, and while it was damaged from the rough ride, it was still drivable. We slowly made our way back to the main road, the drive to the cabin a somber and quiet one. The boys had fallen silent, their earlier excitement replaced by a quiet exhaustion. When we finally arrived at the cabin, it was well past midnight. We were exhausted and shaken, and the experience had left us questioning our reality. We tried to make the best of the rest of our vacation, but the fear of what had happened lingered, making it hard to fully relax. The next morning, we discussed the events of the previous night over breakfast. Mark and I exchanged theories, but nothing seemed to make sense. We considered calling for help or reporting the incident, but the idea seemed almost too surreal to be taken seriously. We tried to enjoy the rest of our trip, but the shadow of that night hung over us. Every time we drove past that stretch of road, the memory of the ghostly figures and the van's strange behavior came rushing back. The experience had left an indelible mark on us, a reminder of how quickly a peaceful journey could turn into a terrifying ordeal. To this day, the memory of that night remains vivid. It's a haunting reminder of the thin line between reality and the supernatural, and the fear of the unknown that can make even the most mundane experiences turn into nightmares. We never spoke much about that night, but it remains a stark reminder of how reality can sometimes blur with the eerie and inexplicable.